Alright, this is a video that I've been wanting to do for quite some time, but I either always forget to do it or I don't think it's the right time to do it, and or whatever, or I just don't have the time to do it. But I always thought that, like, years ago when I would debate younger cats, or other people probably would debate younger cats about the Jordan versus Kobe debate comparison. I always got the feeling that they were under the impression that the Michael Jordan, because most of the uploads at the time, a good percentage of the uploads that I saw on YouTube back in 2006, 7, 8, a lot of them were of Jordan and the Bulls after his first retirement, because the quality of the video was better at that time. So a lot of people were gravitating towards those clips and highlights, younger people. So they were getting the impression that that was him in his prime. And it was making a comparison between that Jordan and prime Kobe. Because at the time, 2006, 2007, 2008, Kobe Bryant was at his prime. And what I would always tell those guys is that that wasn't Jordan in his prime. And in this video, I kind of want to, there's other things too to add to this, but I just want to do a video highlighting some of the things the basic things that I noticed about Jordan that was different when he came back from baseball, excuse me. What was different about him as opposed to before his retirement. And some of these things were changed even before that. The number one thing that I noticed after he came out of retirement, I think it was March 19, 1995, that first game, when he came up with the Pacers. And I didn't pay much attention to it at the time because, you figured the guy would be rusty. You figured he'd be rusty. And while he did have some games where, he was phenomenal, including, I think, his fifth game back from retirement on March 28th when he scored 55 against New York. He had games like that, and I think he had a 48-point game against the Charlotte Hornets in the first round of the playoffs that year. The first thing I noticed was he couldn't finish at the rim. He wasn't quite the same finisher that he was before. I noticed that that first year, that first 17-game stint in the season and the 10 games in the postseason, I think. So the first 27 games he came back, he tried to play in the same style. Many of you guys probably remember that he played more athletically. He was still trying to play in the same basketball style that he played in '93, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't finish in the post the same way. I noticed that he was constantly short on layups, shots that he would normally make in the post. I don't know whether it was the change of his muscle reaction. He was a little bit bigger. A lot of those shots were a little too hard. But that's the thing I noticed. The first thing I noticed, he couldn't finish in the post quite as well. The second thing that I noticed was the unmistakable loss of athleticism. Now, this was something that most of us could start to see. You can make the case it was starting a little bit in 91, 92, but you could definitely see it in 92, 93, that last year. There was a gradual diminishment of his athletic ability. That's the season he went from 29 to 30 years old of age. And that's when you started noticing. I noticed, and most people noticed, he didn't dunk that much that year. He didn't dunk quite as much. He was much more perimeter orientated. You can make the comparison that proportionally he dunked more the year that he came out of retirement than he did that season. I know there's those highlights of him dunking on Morning in 92, 93, And in the finals, he had a game, 55-point game, a couple of games, but he really didn't dunk a lot that season. I think it probably had a lot to do with the fact that his body was really worn out from the 91-92 season. That year they played, I think, 22 games in the postseason. Then he had that year in Barcelona with the Olympics, which he initially didn't want to do. So he was worn out. Yeah, man, Scotty, to be honest with you. But Scotty was a little bit fresher, a little bit younger. But he came out of retirement. Yeah, you really could see it. His vertical was not the same. He didn't quite have that. He still could hang in the air, but not quite the same way. I noticed he was getting his shot blocked a little bit more, especially going in the post. He was still fast, but he didn't quite have the same explosiveness that he had when he was before retirement. I remember Nick Anderson saying something about that, about him not being quite as explosive. I think he said something like, well, number 23, no, I think he said something like number 45, which was his number at the time. Number 45 doesn't quite rev up the same way as number 23. I think he said something like that. And I think that was during that semifinal series that the Bulls eventually lost to Orlando. And that's when Jordan changed back from number 45 to number 23. And going into 96, 97, 98, Jordan played more conservatively. He did not dunk the same way, generally speaking. He tended to dunk more one-handedly. They weren't quite... I guess you could say that his game became a lot more soporific, which means boring. Like it was a little bit boring. I mean, compared to how he played before, it was kind of boring to watch a little bit. But he was still exciting. He was still a great scorer. The only thing I could say that was better about him, I thought that, and this comes from reading later on, I thought he got along with his teammates better as opposed to when he was younger. But that could have been strategic, because he knew that he needed his teammates more now, as opposed to when he was in his prime, when Michael could do it on his own. In his prime, I remember when Michael had a bad game, he would almost always come back with a demonstrative performance. There was, I think I referenced this in a video a couple weeks ago, there was the LeBradford Smith game in 93, I think it was. LeBradford Smith scored like 37 points against the Bulls, on Jordan. And a lot of people killed Jordan about that. And the very next game, coincidentally, had to play the Bullets again. I think they were at home. And Jordan's goal was to score 37 points in the first half. And he almost did it. He scored 36 points. I think he missed a fucking free throw or some shit like that. And he went, he was really pissed off at himself for doing that. I think he wound up scoring 47. Then, he had that game against the Knicks. I think he shot like 3 for 18 in game 3. Next game, game 4, even though the Bulls did win and were down and had cut the lead to 2-1 in that series in 93, Jordan's criticized for shooting 3 for 18. Next game in game 4, he scores 54 points. 93 finals, game 3, the Bulls lose. I think it was in triple overtime. I think that was the game. They lost in triple overtime. I think it was like 129, 121, or 123 or something like that. Jordan scored 44 points, but shot only, I think, 19 of 43 from the field or something like that. Game 4, Jordan was much more efficient, 21-37 shooting, 55 points. Tied for the second most in finals history with Rick Barry, second only eligibility 61 in the 62 NBA finals. So this was something that he constantly did, always came back. This Jordan didn't really do that. He couldn't do that. I remember in '97 against the Miami Heat. You guys might remember recently, early in the playoffs, Kevin Durant tied Michael Jordan's record for most missed field goals in the game. And I remember, I think it was Jalen Rose or somebody said, does anybody really remember when Michael did that? Nobody remembers. Well, I do. I remember it. It was Game 5 of the 1997 Eastern Conference Finals. And I think it was Memorial Day game, too, if I'm mistaken. And I know the Bulls lost something like 89 to 81, or I might have the score a little off. But, yeah, I remember that game because Jordan started the game like 0 for 14 from the field, missing shots that, was mind-boggling. And I think he wound up shooting like 9 for 35 from the field. He did catch fire like in the fourth quarter. I think he shot like something like 7 or 13 in the fourth quarter, but still, horrible game. And everyone expected him in Game 6 to just have this monster performance because he always came back. And then in Game 6, he stunk it up again, shot 11 of 31 from the field. So this was something that was different about Michael back then, like the later Michael. He couldn't generally will himself into a great game, as he seemed to do when he was younger. He needed his teammates more, which is why he probably was, trying to get along with them better, especially Scottie Pippen. You'll notice he really deferred a lot of times to Scottie Pippen and, post-game interviews. And I remember in '96 he was saying, Scottie Pippen was the best player on our team, not me. Another thing I noticed about the older Jordan was he got tired more often. That's something that really, at the time I was like, wow, like he doesn't have the same endurance. But now being an older person myself, I kind of understand what they're talking about. Like, when Jordan was in his 20s, he was doing shit that was like ridiculous. Like that's why I sort of laugh at these comparisons when people try to compare this guy and that guy to Michael Jordan. Jordan was doing shit on an elite level on both sides of the court. He was a lockdown defender in his prime. Now, in his prime, he was a lockdown defender. Teams were afraid to sometimes throw the ball, unless it was an elite scorer. They generally are afraid to even pass the ball on the side of the court where Michael was at. You see what I'm saying? Like, he was that type of level defensive player. And on the other end of the court, he was the best offensive player in the league, by far. That's why, many people like to say he was the greatest player of all time because for a 4-year stretch at the least, he was probably the league's best offensive player and defensive player. Least perimeter defensive player. It was crazy. When he came out of retirement, the latter three-peat, he was probably still the league's best offensive player. I mean, he won the scoring title, so you got to kind of say he's still the best offensive player. But he wasn't quite the same defensive player. He was still one of the league's best defenders, but instead of saying he was like the top 2 guys, really, I'd say he probably was like in the top 20 or 25 in the league in defense. Like, he was still one of the best defensive players, but he wasn't quite the same guy. Matter of fact, you make the argument that he was probably the 4th best defender or 3rd best defender on the team behind Pippen and Rodman and probably sometimes even Harper. Harper was the guy that guarded the tougher assignments. So Jordan sometimes did take the assignments himself and it was still a very good defender. I remember we used to fucking kill Allen Houston. Oh my God, man, he used to kill Allen Houston. Another difference I noticed was he was just, and I alluded to this with the scoring aspect, he wasn't as efficient And I guess I alluded that too with the will thing too. He wasn't as efficient. He was better. He had he much better fadeaway jump shot. Of course, like his mid range game when he came back is what kept him still at an elite level as far as scoring. His mid range game was impeccable. His outside shot had improved considerably. That last year with Chicago in 97, 98, prior to the start of the season, he hurt his finger, supposedly cutting something. I don't know. That's the argument, the story that they use. But I always often question those type of stories. It could have been some other situation, but he hurt his finger, and it fucked up his outside shooting that year. But the two first seasons that he came back were really shit. Even the first 17 game stint, inexplicably, even though he only shot 41% from the field, he shot 50% in three. So for some reason, when Jordan came back, he was a great 3-point shooter, especially from the corners, which was some area, which was an area that he struggled at times when he was younger, shooting corner threes. But that first year he came back to 17 game stint, he shot 50% in three. 96 he shot 43%, 97 37%. So he had really improved from that range. Whereas when he was in his prime, he didn't shoot that shot as much. The first 4 years he was in the league, he didn't really even shoot the 3-pointer that well. Didn't shoot it often. Then he tried to implement that into his game as he started trying to play more off the ball and not try to dominate the ball as much. And he improved his jump shot gradually. During the championship years, those were the years from 90 to 93. He was transitioning from being, this guy that just slashed all the time to being a guy, like I said, play more off the ball. And he was gradually transitioning from being a below average 3-point shooter to an average 3-point shooter to an above average 3-point shooter. 91 and 92, those championship years, I think he shot something like 30% or so from three. The last year with the Bulls, before his retirement, he shot 35% from three. I think he made like 81 3-pointers or something like that. So he was becoming, like I said, a better outside shooter. And I'm trying to think of some other things I may have missed. I think as he got older, he also was a lot more willing to mentor people and give advice. Don't get me wrong, Michael Jordan is still an asshole. But toward other players, he was much more comfortable with the role of ambassador. He still could be petty. Don't get me wrong. I know he was still a jerk at times, but he was much more willing to be an ambassador of the sport. Because I thought when he was younger, he did some foul shit. I didn't like how he treated George Gervin. Well, at the time, I was a little kid. But reading about it as I got older, I don't like how he treated George Gervin. That year when he got injured and the Bulls signed George Gervin, and that was the year he got injured, but he didn't like the fact that they had signed George Gervin because, he already had Orlando Woolridge to contend with as far as dominating the ball, and eventually they got rid of Woolridge, and then, they signed George Gervin, and George Gervin shouldn't even pose a threat to Michael because at the time Gervin was pretty much getting close to being finished. I think Gervin was 34 years old. And, didn't treat him very well. But anyway, Michael sort of took on the same role to an extent toward the game that Julius Erving had 10 years earlier. Now, when it comes to class, I don't think that Michael Jordan and Julius Erving are in the same class. But those are some of pretty much the main differences I noticed with prime Michael Jordan and fadeaway Jordan. He wasn't the same guy at all. I remember Pat Riley saying something about Jordan. I think it was the '97 season. He said Jordan had already attained his greatness, and he called this version of Jordan maintenance Jordan. He's just guarding his legacy, but he's already attained his greatness. He's not the same guy. I remember George Call criticizing him, saying that he's just a jump shooter now. He's afraid of getting hurt, all this type shit, man. So yeah, those are some of the main differences I noticed between prime Michael Jordan and the Jordan that came out of retirement. I'm not even going to talk about Wizards Jordan because the decline was so pronounced by then that if you can't see the difference then, even with the Jordan, of 3.5 years earlier, you could just see the difference in Michael as far as his energy level. I'm going to tell you, this is something I want to say too in conclusion. This is the last thing I want to say. The 97-98 season was when I really noticed the degradation of his skills and game. I was noticing that he was his footwork wasn't the same. I noticed he was slipping a lot. Overall his efficiency was just terrible that year. As I said, Jordan was a historically great mid-range jump shooter. He was shooting in 96 and 97, he was shooting around 48-49% in the mid-range area, where most people shoot somewhere in the high 30s, low 40s. That 98 season, he was shooting around in the mid-range area, not two-pointers, but mid-range. He was shooting about 43%, which was about normal, but it was way down by his standards. On defense, he was slipping a lot. If I said he was a top 25 defender, he had slipped down to maybe a top 40 defender in the league. Like, he wasn't the same guy at all, man. Efficiently, he started the season off horribly when it came to scoring. I think one stretch he was averaging like 24 points a game on 38% shooting, which is Allen Iverson type numbers. You know what I'm saying? But he eventually became more of a slasher, which at age 34, 35 really shouldn't be his game, but he drove to the basket more often. He slashed the basket. Still didn't dunk a lot, but he slashed the basket more. If you look at some of the statistics to back this up, I believe he shot probably like 150 more free throws that year than he did the year prior, which is indicative of how much more he drove to the basket. He scored more in the post. He stopped shooting three-pointers. Really didn't take that shot that often anymore. And he still wound up leading the league in scoring, just edging out Shaq that year. Because it went down to the wire between him. I think Michael ended up scoring 28.7 points per game that year. Shaq 28.3 points per game. I remember that scoring title because that's the only year that I really remember it really going down to the wire with Michael as far as the scoring title is concerned. I might be wrong about that, but I'm trying to think that through a little bit. Yeah, that's the only year. That's the only year I can think of. But I remember there was a game late that year against the Indiana Pacers, and the Bulls wound up losing that game. And it was one of the few times I saw him do it a couple times with the Wizards, but I had never seen him do this before. And I remember Huey Brown called it out. Michael Jordan hung court on defense, and I had never seen him do that before. And that's the first indication I got that this guy really was getting old, because he had to rest. And I think it was a game he didn't shoot very well either. He was getting fatigued. He was tired. You could see it in that game 6 in '98 when he hit the basket against Byron Russell, but he was literally, as Bob Costas said, he was on fumes. He didn't have the same energy level anymore, which was one of the reasons why he wasn't as efficient during the second three-peat as well. I think during the second three-peat, Jordan shot 47.7% from the field, as opposed to when he was in his prime, he shot closer to 52%. One last thing, too. That last year with the Chicago Bulls, when Scottie Pippen missed the first, 44 games or something like that, with the injury, the back injury. And Michael had to take over certain duties that he wasn't accustomed to do. Like, see, another thing, too, I forgot to mention this. During the second three-peat, Michael's role on the team had changed. Whereas when he was younger, vis-a-vis when I said he had more energy, he was able to be everything. He could be a scorer. He could be a playmaker. He handled the ball. One year he was the point guard. Carsino alluded to a video earlier today. He was a point guard during the 88-89 season. A year he averaged like 32.5 points, 8 rebounds, 8 assists. A 6'6", 190-pound guard. He couldn't do that anymore. When he came back, his role was to just score. That was his role. Pippen was the primary ball handler. Pippen and Harper. During those three-peat, if you guys look on YouTube and look up any game from 96 to 98, you seldom saw Jordan bringing the ball up. He might do it for a time or two, but generally, it was Pippen or Harper. Jordan didn't bring the ball. The first thing Jordan would do was go up the court and get in position to score, or try to fight to get in position to score. That was relieving Jordan of the burden of trying to do too much. He was older. He saved his energy for scoring. That's why when Pippen got injured that year, Jordan struggled supremely, because he wasn't used to being in that role of being a ball handler and scorer. He wasn't used to it. And it showed. He got fatigued. He was tired. He was playing heavy minutes earlier that year. Heavy minutes. 42 minutes, 44 minutes, 45 minutes, 41 minutes. A 34-year-old guy. He was old. And eventually he got used to it. Eventually the shooting percentage rose slightly. But he really took off when Pippen came back. He got reacclimated to the role that he was accustomed to. And that's when we saw him, come back to something of the guy we saw, even though he still was not the same guy. But in conclusion, those are some of the reasons, the things that I've noticed that were different between prime Jordan and fadeaway Jordan. So tell me what you guys think.